Mark had lived in his small suburban home for nearly 8 years, and in all that time he had kept to himself. He wasn't the type to get involved in neighborhood drama. He liked quiet mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, evenings working on small projects in his garage, and weekends tending to his garden. The one thing he valued most was privacy. That's why a few years after moving in, he had spent good money building a strong wooden fence around his backyard. It wasn't just for looks, it gave him a safe space where he could relax without feeling like the whole world could see him. The fence was solid, weatherproof, and well-maintained. It stood firmly along the edges of his property, exactly where it was supposed to be, according to the official property survey he had from the city. To Mark, the fence wasn't just wood and nails, it was a symbol of peace. Not up until recently, no one had ever had a problem with it. His neighbor, however, was different. Her name was Linda, though behind closed doors, several neighbors referred to her as Karen. She was in her late 50s, with a sharp voice that could cut through walls, and a habit of acting like she was in charge of everything around her. The first time Mark met her, she had been friendly enough, offering him a slice of banana bread when he moved in, but over the years, that friendliness had soured into constant criticism. She would complain if his grass grew too long, if he parked his truck too close to the curb, or even if he left his garbage bins out an extra hour after pickup. Lately, her focus had shifted to the fence. For months, she had been making comments about it whenever they crossed paths. "It's such a shame this fence blocks the view of the shortcut," she'd say, almost as if she was talking to herself, but loud enough for Mark to hear. "People used to be able to walk through here before you put this thing up." At first, Mark didn't pay much attention. The shortcut she was referring to was a narrow dirt path on the other side of his fence that led through a small cluster of trees and into the next neighborhood. It wasn't official public property. It was just a strip of unused land that separated his property from hers. When Mark built his fence, he didn't block the path entirely. It still existed behind his yard, but it no longer connected directly to her backyard. If she wanted to use it, she would have to walk a little further around the block. Apparently, that small inconvenience was unacceptable to her. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Mark pulled into his driveway and immediately noticed something strange. From the corner of his eye, he saw the gap in the fence. His first thought was that maybe a strong storm had blown through and damaged it, but as he walked closer, his heart sank. A whole section of the fence, nearly 6 feet wide, had been cut down. The wooden panels lay scattered in the grass, splintered at the edges. His stomach twisted with disbelief. Leaning against the remaining part of the fence was a pair of bolt cutters and a handsaw, the kind you might find in a hardware store. They didn't belong to him. And then, as if the scene wasn't shocking enough, he saw her. Linda was standing in her backyard, casually raking leaves like nothing unusual had happened. When she noticed him staring at the wreckage, she didn't even look guilty. She simply put down her rake, walked toward the gap, and smiled in that smug way she had perfected over the years. "Oh, I see you found it," she said, as if she were talking about a surprise gift instead of vandalism. "I needed access to the path again. It's public space, you know, so that fence shouldn't have been blocking it." Mark was too stunned to speak for a moment. "You cut my fence down," he finally said, his voice tight. "It's not your fence if it's on public land," she replied, crossing her arms. "And besides, I've been using that shortcut for years. You can't just take it away from people." Mark's mind was already spinning. He had personally paid for the property survey when he built the fence, and he knew for a fact that every single post was planted well inside his property line. "It is my fence," he said firmly, "and it's entirely on my property. You had no right to touch it." She gave a little shrug, like it was no big deal. "Well, it's done now. If you put it back up, I'll just take it down again. You can't block what isn't yours." Mark took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. "It is mine, and you've just committed property damage." That was when she laughed, a short, sharp laugh that sent a flare of anger through him. "Oh, please," she said, "the police won't do anything. It's a civil matter. Go ahead, call them." Mark stared at her for a long moment before pulling out his phone. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. Within 15 minutes, a patrol car pulled up in front of his house. 2 officers stepped out, listened to both sides of the story, and then gave Mark the disappointing news. She was technically right about one thing. While it was absolutely wrong for her to damage his fence, it wasn't something they could arrest her for. They advised him to document the damage, keep receipts for repairs, and take her to small claims court if necessary. Linda stood there the whole time with a smug smile, like she had just won some kind of battle. "Told you," she muttered under her breath. When the police left, Mark quietly gathered the tools she had left on the grass and set them by her gate. He didn't trust himself to say anything else at that moment. He went inside, sat down at his kitchen table, and stared at the survey papers he kept in his home office. The black and white map confirmed exactly what he already knew. The fence was on his land. Every inch of it was legally his. Still, the whole situation left him feeling powerless. Sure, he could take her to court, but that would mean months of frustration, paperwork, and probably more ugly confrontations. The worst part wasn't even the physical damage, it was the message she had sent loud and clear. She believed she could do whatever she wanted, and no one could stop her. That night, Mark walked out into his backyard with a flashlight. He shined the beam along the property line, tracing where the fence had stood. In the cool evening air, the quiet was almost heavy. He imagined what it would be like if every neighbor behaved like Linda, if people could just walk into each other's yards, tear things down, and claim public access as an excuse. It was ridiculous. He wasn't about to let that happen. Over the next couple of days, Mark repaired the section of the fence himself, made it sturdy, just like before. But in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't over. Linda's comments about public land and access weren't going to stop. He had seen that glint in her eye, the kind of determination that made her dangerous in a petty way. She was the type who would keep pushing until she got what she wanted, and so, without really planning to, Mark started keeping track of everything. Every time she made a comment, he wrote it down. If she came onto his property, he made a note of it. He took photos of the fence from different angles with date stamps. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. She wanted to fight, he was going to be ready. But at that moment, sitting at his kitchen table late one night, with the survey papers spread out in front of him, Mark wasn't thinking about revenge or big moves. He was just thinking about how strange it was that a simple fence that had caused no trouble for years could suddenly become the center of such hostility. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. All right, here's part 2, expanded into around 2,000 words. In simple, engaging English, no headings. It's making it feel like a real-life story someone is telling. For a little while after fixing the fence, things stayed quiet. Mark allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the whole ugly situation had ended there. He thought Linda might realize she'd crossed the line and decide to leave him alone. But if there was one thing he was starting to understand about her, it was that she didn't let go of grudges. The first sign came only a week after the repair. One morning, Mark went out to get his mail and found a folded piece of paper taped to the new section of the fence. The handwriting was neat but sharp, each letter pressed into the paper as though the pen had been pushed too hard. This fence is unnecessary. It blocks community access and makes the neighborhood less friendly. Please remove it for the good of all. There was no signature, but Mark didn't need one. He could practically hear her voice in every word. He pulled the note down, crumpled it in his fist, and dropped it into the trash can by the driveway. He thought about going over to her yard and telling her to stop, but he knew that would only invite another argument. Instead, he decided to ignore it. But ignoring Linda was like ignoring a dripping faucet, didn't stop the problem. It only made it worse over time. Over the next few weeks, she began making comments every time they crossed paths. If he was mowing his lawn, she'd yell over the fence, "You're wasting your energy, you know. That fence won't last forever." If he was unloading groceries, she'd call out, "You can't keep people out forever. They'll find a way." Mark stayed calm in public, but in private, he was growing more and more irritated. He started wondering if she was saying the same things to other neighbors. That question was answered one Saturday afternoon when his next-door neighbor, Paul, stopped by. Paul was a friendly, easygoing guy in his early 40s who often borrowed tools from Mark and returned them without a scratch. He leaned against the fence and said, "Hey, just so you know, Linda's been talking about you at the HOA meetings." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What's she saying?" Paul shrugged. "Same thing she's been telling you, that your fence is blocking some historic walking path or something. She's making it sound like you put it up to spite the neighborhood." Mark let out a short laugh. "That's ridiculous. I got city approval before I even put in the first post." "Yeah, I know," Paul said. "But you know how people are. Some of them believe whatever they hear first." That got under Mark's skin more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about his reputation. He'd lived here for years without any real conflict, and now, thanks to her, he was becoming the guy with the selfish fence. The final straw came a few days later. When he went out to trim the hedges along the side of his property, as he rounded the corner, he froze. The hedge that ran right along the boundary between his yard and Linda's had been cut badly. Whole sections were missing, the branches jagged like someone had hacked them with garden shears, before he could even process it. Linda appeared on her side of the property line, holding a pair of pruning shears. "You're welcome," she said. "For what?" Mark asked, still staring at the damage. "Your hedges were hanging over the line," she said matter-of-factly. "I trimmed them back for you." "They were not hanging over the line," Mark replied sharply. "And even if they were, you can't just come onto my property and start cutting my plants." She smiled, a smile that wasn't friendly at all. "I didn't come onto your property. I cut them from my side. If you don't like it, maybe you should check your measurements. Property lines change, you know?" That comment hit differently. Property lines don't just change. They are fixed unless someone legally redefines them. The fact that she even said that made Mark wonder what she was planning. The next day, when he was taking out the trash, she was waiting for him by the sidewalk. She had her arms crossed and an expression that was half smirk, half glare, she said. "Someday that property line will be mine. Then you'll see how it feels to be on the other side of the fence." Mark didn't respond. He just walked past her and went inside, but his mind was racing. Why would she say that? Was she bluffing? Or did she know something he didn't? That night, he sat down at his computer and started researching property ownership and easements in his area. He pulled up county maps, scanned old deeds, and read through more boring legal documents than he thought possible. It was during one of these late-night searches that he stumbled across something unusual. The strip of land running along the back edge of Linda's yard where the shortcut wasn't officially part of her property. In fact, according to county records, it hadn't belonged to any homeowner in decades. It was technically owned by the county because of unpaid taxes from a long-ago foreclosure. At first, he didn't think much of it. Land like that just sat there, unused for years. But then he realized what it meant. Linda had no legal right to use that strip as her own yard, and certainly no right to demand access through it. If anything, she had been trespassing every time she walked across it. This discovery made him curious. He bookmarked the county's property records site and checked it every few days. He even set up a reminder on his phone to see if there were any changes to that strip of land. It wasn't that he had a specific plan, at least not yet. It was more like he was arming himself with information, just in case. Meanwhile, the petty battles continued. She started parking her car right at the edge of his driveway, close enough to make it difficult for him to back out. She would water her lawn so aggressively that streams of water ran under the fence into his yard. She even left dog waste just over the property line where she knew he'd see it when mowing the grass. Mark documented everything. He took photos, videos, and notes. He even kept a small folder in his desk labeled Linda, where he stored all the evidence. Friends who visited would sometimes joke about it, saying, "Man, you're building a case file like you're the FBI?" But Mark didn't think it was funny. He knew that with someone like her, you needed proof for everything. The turning point came one morning in early spring. Mark was sipping coffee on his porch when he saw a white envelope in his mailbox. With the county's logo on it, inside was a notice about an upcoming tax lien auction. He glanced through the list of properties for sale, not expecting to see anything familiar until he spotted it. There, about halfway down the page, was the narrow strip of land behind Linda's yard. The county was selling it to recover decades of unpaid taxes. Mark stared at the paper for a long time, the gears in his mind turning. This was the same piece of land she'd been fighting over all this time, the same land she claimed gave her access. And in a matter of weeks, it would be up for sale to the highest bidder. A slow, almost involuntary smile spread across his face. For the first time since this whole mess began, it felt like he had the upper hand. The letter from the county sat on Mark's kitchen table for the rest of the morning. He must have read it a dozen times, slowly letting the meaning sink in. That narrow strip of land behind Linda's property, the one she'd been treating like her personal backyard, wasn't hers at all. And now the county was putting it up for sale in a tax-lien auction. It felt almost unreal. For months, she had been making his life miserable, talking about access and public land, cutting his fence, and spreading rumors about him. Now, without her even knowing it, that same piece of ground she fought for was about to be available to anyone willing to buy it. He wasn't sure at first if he should even get involved. Buying land, even a small piece, wasn't something you just did without thinking. But the more he imagined the possibilities, the more it made sense. If he owned that strip, it would give him complete control over the boundary. She wouldn't be able to use the shortcut at all. She couldn't claim it was public, and she couldn't argue about property lines because the land would be his. The county auction was only 3 weeks away, which meant he didn't have much time to prepare. He started by digging deeper into the property records, making sure there were no hidden complications, no strange easements, no pending claims. The records confirmed what he hoped. The land was clean. It was just an abandoned strip that had been forgotten after a foreclosure decades earlier. Mark decided to keep this information completely to himself. He didn't tell Paul, he didn't mention it to anyone at work, and he certainly didn't say a word to Linda. If she found out about the auction, she might try to get it herself or worse, warn someone else who would bid just to spite him. This was going to be his quiet move. In the days leading up to the auction, he made a point to act normal around her. He waved politely if they crossed paths. He went about his yard work as usual, and he didn't react to the occasional snide comment she tossed his way. He wanted her to think things had settled down, that maybe he'd stopped caring. The truth was, he was more focused than ever. Every night, he sat at his desk, looking at the map of the neighborhood with that thin strip of land highlighted in yellow. He imagined extending his fence to cover it completely, imagined planting tall shrubs along it, maybe even adding a small storage shed. It wasn't a huge piece of land, but it was enough to give him total control over the very things she wanted most. When the day of the auction finally arrived, Mark got up early, dressed in plain clothes, and drove to the county building. The auction was held in a large, echoing room with rows of folding chairs. At the front, a county official stood behind a podium, reading out property descriptions one by one. Most of the properties were small odd lots, unused farmland, or tiny parcels behind old buildings. Bidders were clearly there for serious investments. They had clipboards, calculators, and whispered discussions about zoning. Mark sat quietly in the back, waiting for the listing he cared about. When the county official read the description of the strip behind Linda's yard, Mark felt his heart rate pick up. The starting bid was surprisingly low, so low, in fact, that it made him wonder if anyone else would even care about it. The first few seconds passed in silence, and then Mark raised his hand. The auctioneer nodded. "We have an opening bid." The man in the second row glanced at the listing sheet and raised his hand too. Mark's stomach tightened. Someone else wanted it. The bidding moved slowly, $50 higher, then another 50. The other bidder didn't seem too aggressive, almost like he was interested but not committed. When the price reached just a few $100s, the man shook his head and lowered his hand. Mark's was the only hand left in the air. "Sold," the auctioneer said, banging the gavel. It was done. In less than 2 minutes, Mark had bought the land that had been at the center of months of frustration. He paid the deposit, signed the paperwork, and left the building feeling lighter than he had in a long time. Of course, the purchase still had to be processed. It would take a couple of weeks for the deed to be officially recorded in his name, but that didn't bother him. What mattered was that the decision was final. The land was his. For the next 2 weeks, he kept up the act of normal life. He mowed his lawn, worked in his garage, and gave Linda no reason to suspect anything had changed. She, on the other hand, seemed to be in an especially smug mood lately. One afternoon, as he was trimming the bushes, she leaned over the fence and said, "I've been thinking. Maybe I'll put a little gate in here so I can get to the path easier. That way we can both enjoy it." Mark forced a polite smile, hiding the fact that in just a few days she wouldn't be stepping foot on that path ever again. "We'll see," he said casually. The day the deed finally arrived in the mail was one Mark would never forget. Envelope was thick and official-looking, and inside was the document with his name printed clearly as the new owner. It felt almost surreal, holding proof that the land was now his. He didn't waste any time. That afternoon, he went to the hardware store and bought bright orange property markers, wooden stakes, and a roll of sturdy string. When he got back, he walked along the edge of the strip, measuring carefully and placing the stakes exactly where the property began and ended. He hadn't been at it more than 10 minutes when he heard her voice behind him. "What are you doing?" Turned to see Linda standing with her hands on her hips, her face twisted into suspicion. "Marking my property," he said simply. She frowned. "Your property. This isn't your property." "It is now," he replied, pulling the folded deed from his back pocket and holding it out for her to see. "Bought it at the county auction. All legal, all official." Her eyes scanned the paper, and for a moment she looked genuinely confused. Then her expression hardened. "This is harassment," she said. "You're doing this just to make my life difficult." "No," Mark said evenly. "I'm doing this to protect what's mine, just like you said you were doing when you cut my fence." She sputtered for a moment, searching for a comeback, but he didn't give her the chance. He turned back to his work, hammering the stakes into the ground. By the end of the afternoon, the strip was clearly marked. The next day, he started putting up a taller, more secure fence, one that left no gap, no shortcut, and no room for public access. From his kitchen window, he could see her watching him, pacing in her yard, making phone calls. He imagined she was calling the HOA, the police, maybe even the county, trying to undo what had been done. But it wouldn't matter. The paperwork was in his name now, and there was nothing she could do about it. Mark didn't say it out loud, but inside, he was enjoying the irony. After months of her pushing, threatening, and cutting down what wasn't hers, he had turned the tables completely. The very land she wanted so badly was now behind his fence, out of her reach forever. And this, he knew, was only the beginning of the fallout. The morning after the new fence posts went in, the neighborhood felt different. It was quiet, but not in the usual peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that comes when you know a storm is coming. Mark could almost feel the tension in the air, and he knew exactly where it was coming from. From the moment the sun rose, Linda was outside. He noticed her through his blinds pacing along her side of the property line, staring at the bright orange markers, then at the unfinished fence. She kept making phone calls, her voice rising and falling, and at one point he saw her waving her arms. It's like she was trying to explain something to someone who didn't believe her. Mark ignored it. He made himself a big breakfast, took his time eating, and then went back outside to continue his work. The plan was simple. Finish the fence as fast as possible before she had a chance to pull any kind of trick. He was tightening one of the horizontal beams when he heard her footsteps crunching over the grass. She stopped just on her side of the boundary, but her body leaned forward like she was about to step over it. "You can't just do this," she said, her voice already sharp. "I can," Mark replied without looking at her. "I own this land now. I have the deed. You saw it." "That was a mistake," she said quickly. "I've already called the county. They're going to fix it." Mark finally looked up, squinting in the sunlight. "The county sold it fair and square. They can't just take it back because you don't like it." She folded her arms tightly, her face tightening. "You think you're clever, don't you? Buying this just to spite me." "No," Mark said calmly. "I bought it to stop you from cutting my fence down again. And now you won't have to worry about this path anymore. 'Cause it's not yours to worry about." Her cheeks turned red. "That path has been there longer than you've lived here. People use it. You're taking it away from the community." Mark set his hammer down and leaned against the fence post, meeting her eyes. "The community is you. You're the only one who uses it. Everyone else walks the normal way." Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began snapping photos of the fence, the posts, the markers, anything she could find. Mark went back to work, letting the sound of the drill drown out her muttering. Within a couple of hours, the fence was nearly finished. He worked with purpose, knowing the less time she had to interfere, the better. Around midday, he took a short break. As he was sipping water, a white SUV pulled up in front of Linda's house. Two people stepped out, a man and a woman, both wearing HOA badges clipped to their shirts. Mark sighed. He knew this was coming. The HOA reps walked straight to the fence line where Linda was already waiting, arms folded like a queen about to deliver orders. She started speaking rapidly, pointing at the fence and then at Mark, her voice full of drama. The reps listened politely before turning to Mark. "Double quotes, Mr. Henderson," the woman said. "We've received a complaint about this fence and the property line. Need to verify that what you're doing complies with HOA guidelines." Mark didn't hesitate. He pulled the deed from his pocket and handed it over. "This is the recorded document from the county. As of 2 weeks ago, I own this land. The fence is within the new boundary, and I'm following all height and design codes and the HOA rules." The man scanned the paper, then nodded slowly. "Damned everything. Looks legitimate." Linda's voice shot up an octave. "No, you don't understand. He only bought it to get rid of the shortcut. People have used that path for decades." The woman from the HOA looked at her evenly. "Is this land public?" "Well, no," Linda admitted reluctantly. "But then it's private property now," the woman said firmly. "Dan, he has every right to fence it off." The look on Linda's face at that moment was priceless. It was as if someone had just pulled the rug out from under her. She stood there, speechless, while the HOA reps handed Mark back his deed and wished him a good day. After they left, Mark expected her to storm inside and slam the door, but she didn't. Instead, she stayed by the fence, glaring at him like she was trying to burn holes through his shirt with her eyes. "You think you've won?" she said finally, her voice low and cold. "I don't think," Mark replied. "I know." For the rest of the afternoon, she kept to her yard, but he could feel her watching. Every time he carried a piece of wood or tightened a screw, he could sense her eyes following him. He finished the last section of the fence just as the sun was starting to set. The tall panels now stood solid and unbroken, stretching across the entire property line, including the strip that used to be her shortcut. When he was done, he stepped back and admired the work. It wasn't just a fence anymore, it was a wall. Between him and months of petty harassment, on his side it meant peace and privacy. On her side, it meant the end of her little backdoor route. The next day, she tried a different tactic. Around noon, she came over holding a cup of coffee. Her voice softer than usual. "Look, maybe we can work something out," she said. "If you just leave a little gator opening, I'll pay you for it. Not a lot, but enough to make it worth your while." Mark shook his head. "No gate, no opening. The whole point of this fence is to stop uninvited access." Her smile didn't last long, slid right off her face, replaced by that familiar scowl. "Fine. Enjoy your prison." Mark didn't reply. He just turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. Over the next few days, the gossip started. Mark could tell because neighbors would glance at him a little longer when walking past, or they'd ask leading questions like, "So, heard you've been doing some remodeling?" It was obvious Linda was telling her version of the story. But to his relief, most people seemed amused rather than angry. A few even congratulated him privately, saying things like, "Good for you." Someone needed to stand up to her. The fence became more than just a barrier. It became a quiet symbol in the neighborhood. People didn't say it out loud, but Mark could tell they were rooting for him. Linda, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling. She made more phone calls, tried to rally other neighbors to fight for the path, and even left another note in his mailbox about how selfishness destroys communities. Mark tossed it straight into the trash. By the end of the week, it was clear she had lost. The fence was up, the deed was recorded. Every authority she could think to call had told her the same thing. There was nothing she could do. And for the first time in months, Mark could step into his backyard without wondering what kind of stunt she might pull next. But deep down, he had a feeling she wasn't done, not completely. People like Linda didn't just admit defeat. They either moved away, or they kept looking for the next fight. He had no idea which one she'd choose. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark could walk into his backyard and feel completely at ease. The tall new fence stood strong, the fresh wood smelling faintly sweet in the warm sun. The strip of land that had once been the cause of all the tension was now entirely his, closed off and secure. He didn't have to see Linda unless he wanted to. He didn't have to listen to her lectures about community access or historic walking paths. It was amazing how quickly the atmosphere in his own home had changed. For every sound outside, every bark of her dog, every slam of her car door had set his nerves on edge. Now, those sounds barely reached him. The fence didn't just block sight, it seemed to block stress too. At first, Linda kept up her usual habits. She would stand in her yard glaring at the fence like she was trying to will it to disappear. Sometimes she'd mutter things loud enough for him to hear. Comments about how selfishness always comes back to bite you, or some people just don't know how to be neighbors. But there was no more yelling, no more direct confrontations. It was like she was slowly running out of fuel. The neighborhood, however, was buzzing. Word had spread about the auction and how Mark had managed to buy the land out from under her. Without her even knowing it was for sale, the story seemed to take on a life of its own, and Mark started noticing little signs that people were quietly taking his side. Paul from next door stopped by one afternoon while Mark was staining the new fence. "I've got to hand it to you," Paul said with a grin. "That was brilliant. I didn't think anyone would ever be able to put her in her place, but you did it." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "I just wanted her to leave me alone." "Yeah, well," Paul said, "sometimes you've got to show people you're not a doormat. Trust me, most of the street is on your side." That was a relief. Mark had been worried that some neighbors might see him as the bad guy, but the opposite seemed true. People he barely knew would wave when they drove by, and once, a couple walking their dogs stopped to tell him they admired how he'd handled the situation. Linda, though, didn't take the loss gracefully. For the next month, she tried everything she could think of to make him regret it. She filed 2 more complaints with the HO, both dismissed immediately. She claimed his fence was too tall, then said it was an eyesore. She even tried to argue that the strip of land was still part of some old easement that gave her access. But the county shut that down in writing. The more she failed, the more distant she seemed to grow. She stopped waving at other neighbors, stopped attending HOA meetings, and spent most of her time indoors. Mark would see her curtains twitch sometimes when he was outside, but she didn't come over to talk anymore. Then one afternoon in early summer, he noticed something new, a for sale sign planted in her front yard. It caught him completely off guard. For a moment, he wondered if this was her final move away, of leaving the neighborhood on her own terms. Before anyone could say she'd been driven out. Whatever the reason, the sign was real, and within days, a realtor's lockbox appeared. On her front door, the gossip machine kicked into overdrive. Paul told him that Linda had already started moving boxes out of the house. Another neighbor mentioned seeing her cleaning the garage. Muttering under her breath the whole time, Mark didn't celebrate out loud, but he couldn't deny feeling a sense of relief. It wasn't that he wanted her gone. Well, maybe a little lit was that he wanted the constant tension to disappear. If she left, the fights, the notes, the complaints, all of it would finally be over. Over the next few weeks, strangers came to tour her house. Some looked curious, others serious, but none stayed long. Mark kept his distance, but he noticed. She made a point of standing near the fence whenever buyers visited, as if she was trying to silently send a message about the difficult neighbor next door. If she hoped that would scare people off, it didn't seem to work. By the end of summer, a moving truck appeared in her driveway. Mark watched from his kitchen window as movers loaded furniture, boxes, and even her dog's house into the truck. She supervised everything, wearing sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. Her lips pressed into a thin line. At one point, their eyes met. She didn't smile, wave, or say anything, just turned and walked back into her house. By evening, the truck was gone. The house sat dark and empty, the for sale sign replaced with a sold sticker. The first night without her felt strange. It wasn't just the quiet, it was the feeling of finality. For so long, their lives had been tangled together in this petty battle. And now, just like that, it was over. The next morning, Mark went out into his yard with a cup of coffee and walked along the length of his fence. The air was cool, the grass damp with dew. He stopped at the far corner, looking at the strip of land he had fought for, not with shouting or more destruction, but with patience and a bit of strategy. It struck him how ironic the whole thing was. All her scheming, all her attempts to take what wasn't hers. And in the end, she had lost part of her own backyard's usefulness. The shortcut she'd been so obsessed with was now completely off limits. The very boundary she'd wanted to erase was now stronger than ever. As the weeks went by, a new family moved into Linda's old house, a couple in their 30s with a young daughter. They introduced themselves right away, brought over cookies, and asked if it was okay to plant flowers along their side of the property line. Mark smiled and said yes. It felt like the neighborhood had gotten a breath of fresh air. One afternoon, while the little girl was playing with her dog in their yard, she pointed at the fence and asked her mom what's on the other side. The mom laughed and said, "Just our neighbor's yard, sweetie. He likes his privacy." Mark smiled to himself. Privacy. That's all he'd wanted from the very beginning. Life settled into a calm rhythm after that. The fence became just another part of the yard, no longer a battleground. The strip of land behind it stayed neat and well kept, with a row of trees Mark had planted to make it even more peaceful. Sometimes, when he was out there watering the plants or mowing, he'd think back to that day he came home to find the fence cut down. At the time, it had felt like the start of a nightmare, but in a strange way it had also set in motion the events that led to this: the quiet, the peace, the knowledge that he'd stood his ground and protected what was his. He didn't gloat, didn't tell the story to everyone who asked, but every now and then, when a neighbor would mention how much nicer things felt without all the drama, he'd just give a small smile and say, "Sometimes you've got to play the long game." In this game, Mark knew he had one.